I'm Pedro Gerson. I'm the Director of Practice over at the Pozen Center. I'll be moderating this panel, and I'm going to first invite Zachary Yeoh to come up and tell us about he was working at Daly and Associates and tell us about his experience.
Hi, I'm Zachary Yeoh. I am a fourth year philosophy major and human rights minor. I throughout my academic career, I think if I can just give a short academic life story, I guess, I've been kind of doing lots of theory in philosophy. And then part of me wanted to look at more practical avenues of applying what I've learned. And so that led me to the human rights minor. Through various legal work experiences, I was able to witness firsthand the way that ethics was integrated into society. And through the Pozen Internship program, I was able to kind of take my interests beyond the theoretical and, actually help people on the ground, which was, well, I'll talk about it later, but it was really, really fulfilling. So over summer, I was lucky enough to get an internship at Daly and Associates, which is a law firm in Hong Kong, which works on cases on a pro bono basis, a majority of which are asylum cases. Given the, let's say, current political climate in Hong Kong, a lot of the human rights work there is largely refugee law now. As Hong Kong isn't signatory to the 1951 convention relating to the status of refugees and has no legal framework governing the granting of asylum, a lot of work is done by NGOs and by firms such as Daly and Associates in handling asylum claims and guiding asylum seekers through the process of filing non-refoulement claims, which is how to prevent yourself from being deported, essentially, through Hong Kong's unified screening mechanism. I realize that that's just a bunch of jargon. Essentially, if you successfully fill out a non-refoulement claim and are recognized as a refugee, you can be resettled into, countries like the US or Canada. And during my internship, I learned a lot about the historical development of non-refoulement law in Hong Kong, as you can kind of tell by me just spewing a bunch of keywords out. The historical legal cases which have expanded systems of consideration to the one that we have now in Hong Kong, which was implemented in 2014, and also the grounds on which screening is applied to each individual case. And I mentioned those because it was incredibly important to be aware of the stages of the process, as well as the applicable grounds on which each asylum seeker can make their case in order to best help their case and, kind of push it forward. Each case was different. Some were further along, some were further behind. Each client had gone through their own hardships from their own home countries with drastically different timelines. Some people were stuck in the system for 10 years. Some were just getting into it. And each client had differing levels of evidence and differing levels of reliability as well, which were all factors that, you kind of needed to take into account when evaluating each case. And that this also meant that, to best represent the client, you also had to be very aware of their country of origin and the political and social contexts that came with it, their timeline of events and how it could be backed up or refuted by alternative accounts or information, how their claims kind of apply to the country now and also forward looking in the future, as well as, their own personal contexts now. Like if you came into the country, well, if you came into Hong Kong with, like, let's say a pregnant wife, 10 years later, your wife's not going to be pregnant anymore. You're going to have a kid. And, like whether they had committed offenses, which would have put their claims at risk as well. That's another factor because the welfare system is not enough to kind of keep people afloat, especially for that long. So a lot of them resort to under the table work, let's say, I guess. And, like this was even more compounded by the fact that it was a very small firm of around like 15 people, requiring everyone to be juggling multiple cases at once. I think like on average, I was helping out in like 4 to 6 cases at any given moment, which was a little high stress, but I'll talk about it later. My research largely focused on looking through previous like interview and evidentiary materials from earlier screening stages, previous court judgments, recent country of origin information, and also similar court cases. And, like given the heavy workload, sorry, it's been a long day. It was vital to work with other relevant case handlers and interns also working on the case to kind of distribute the workload. And so it allowed me to get to know everyone in the office really, really well. And but my favorite aspect of the internship was definitely being able to go to court and watch this landmark case happen in the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal, where it was ruled that the Hong Kong government must provide alternative means of recognizing same-sex partnerships, and that the absence of an alternative meant that the Hong Kong government had kind of committed a violation of the constitutional right to privacy. And it was an insane experience, actually, just like sitting in the courtroom and just thinking like, oh God, I'm actually witnessing a landmark case happen in real time. Like having previously looked into the case even before I was, working at Daly, and also, kind of following the fight for LGBTQ rights in Hong Kong, just being present in the courtroom and following the complex legal arguments on constitutional interpretation and the duties of government. Like it was just an insane experience. And it was like, I think one of the strongest reassurances that working in human rights can be like deeply gratifying with a, insane tangible impact that can create lasting change in so many people's lives and communities. And, like having gone through the internship, I firmly believe that even if given the chance, I would have done like nothing differently when it came to my search for the internship or the internship itself. Like it served as a reminder of the importance of the work that I was doing. And although I mentioned that it was incredibly mentally strenuous at times, which it was, I found that the sense of, purpose and potential to make a meaningful impact really heavily outweighed the negatives. And I am honestly eager to get back into the field doing this work and helping people address the injustices that they face. Thank you.
Up next, we have Danielle Lopez, who worked for the Cook County Department of Human Rights. So I think a very different perspective.
So yeah, my name is Danielle Lopez. I worked at the Cook County Department of during my summer, and we'll have a cute picture of Terry Perigal next to the logo. I'm just going to introduce myself really quickly. I'm from Las Vegas, Nevada, born and raised, but my family's roots are in Honduras in the Philippines. I'm really passionate about racial justice. So I'm an anthropology and an RDI double major, but I'm also looking at MAPS programs, which are like the Master of Arts programs. I am more so interested in like, how can we actually mobilize and make change in, in racial justice. So I look a lot at like education. I look at like academia, like research. And then more personally, I also look at like indigenous rights in the context of my countries, US, Central America, Southeast Asia. And I really like to work with like media, data, visual arts, and music. So some fun things I do, as you can see, I like draw comics and I play soccer. So that's a little bit about me. So how I ended up at the Commission of Human Rights is really interesting. Because of my background, I was looking for a lot more grassroots organizations. But unfortunately, because of COVID, a lot of indigenous orgs were they were hit really badly. And I think organization wise, they were not like, they were unable to provide have an intern with them, which is okay, right? I understand. So Cook County sort of came along and I was interested in the mission of it. First of all, the Commission of Human Rights specifically is a subset within the Cook County government. So you have like a public defender's office, like stuff like that people have heard of, but human rights I had never heard of. So the department itself has a split human rights section and an ethics section. I worked in the human rights section. Ethics sort of deals with like human rights investigations. So like abuses, if it's been filed as a complaint. But more broadly, I worked in the human rights side. And just to summarize what the department does, to protect people in Cook County from forms of discrimination and harassment within the scope of like employment, housing, public accommodations, credit transactions, and any access to Cook County services. So also they work with like minimum wage and, earn sick leave, which I'll talk more about my experiences with. And these are like the 4 categories in red that I highlighted that I worked on. But I talked a little bit with people in the investigation side too. It's just the scope as an outreach intern. I was primarily focused on these 3 categories, policy, research, and outreach. Outreach probably being the biggest one. So, but first I'm going to talk about policy. So in terms of like what the Human Rights Commission produces, there's something called the Human Rights Ordinance. And this is more so unique to Cook County, but you might also see other counties like, let's say, Seattle, Los Angeles, or even on the federal level. There's all these different kinds of human rights ordinances that can exist, but this is specific to Cook County. So what I was working on was recently they had made adjustments to the Human Rights Ordinance to basically revise the definition of unlawful discrimination. And they were also changing terminology around Indigenous Americans. So my role was basically providing outreach and communicating with a lot of local organizations in Chicago that communicated this change. So at the bottom is like sort of the new the changed unlawful discrimination definition. And what was new was that they included like hair texture and protective hairstyles as part of what would constitute unlawful discrimination in the workplace and like housing, etc. I know bodily autonomy was also added, but my primary focus was on traits associated with race and also caste. So fun fact, Cook County is the only county at the county level to enact caste protections, I think in the US. So there's other cities like LA and Seattle that have adopted caste protections, but we're like the first county at county level. So I think that's really cool. So how did I do that? So outreach. So the top picture is me giving like a government training. So part of my responsibility was giving like recorded government trainings on how people can learn about this information for themselves. And at the time, the Human Rights Ordinance wasn't like edited yet. It was accepted. And basically how that works is the Board of Commissioners have to meet, which is like higher up from the Commission of Human Rights. And so they meet and they reconvene and they talk about adjustments to the Human Rights Ordinance. So that was approved when I had just became an intern. So my job was basically like, okay, I have to explain to the public how to access that information and how they can file a complaint, how they can, basically like find out the information. And then the bottom 3 are just like some graphics that I made. I have some cooler ones later. Basically, advertising on Instagram, Facebook, the Cook County Facebook and stuff, about like these new protections, as well as like, holidays, because we try to honor like we try to abide by like federal holiday standards. So International Day of Indigenous Peoples, Women's Equality Day. So we're basically like, doing outreach like that. And then I also worked on some data stuff. So this is not as exciting, but it was very necessary. So to explain it simply, I was trying to verify labor laws across municipalities in Cook County with available government and nonprofit data. So Arise Chicago is like a labor organization in Chicago that has a lot of data on which municipalities in Cook County abide by those labor laws in the context of like earned sick leave. So there's like a county level earned sick leave. And then there's like the municipality, actually, there's the federal, like the, how do I explain it? State of Illinois, there we go. And then the Cook County level. And municipalities can either choose to opt into the Cook County one, which is a bit better than the state of Illinois. And some don't, most people don't like opt into the Cook County one. So part of that was like calling a bunch of offices being like, what are your current earned sick leave policies so I can update our database, stuff like that. And the North American industry classification system, it was just me manually like checking a lot of sort of like businesses that had had complaints filed against it in the past and making sure that they aligned with available classification codes for the type of industry that that business was in. And then I mentioned I made some cooler graphics. So the more important thing I think was recently Cook County released like the Just Housing Amendment and the Equity Fund reports. And this was basically, my role was looking at the refugees and immigrants history of Cook County, as well as making graphics of like the reports for some of the Just Housing amendments that had just been passed for 2023. So these are some of the graphics I made. I was very proud of them. And then my last takeaways, I would say, you might notice that there's a lot of like when you're working in government, even at the local level, there's a lot of like, how should I say it, bureaucracy that is involved. So I think I would recommend Cook County if you don't mind that and you don't like want to like publicly face people. I like facing people, but I think Cook County is a great experience if you're looking for something more behind the scenes and you don't really mind the bureaucracy part of your internship experience. I still feel like I did like useful things and you still get the opportunity to interact and meet with local organizations in the Chicago area. But I will say like I found sometimes like how many people I had to communicate with to get to one point kind of tedious. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you, Danielle. Up next, also someone who stayed local, Fernanda Ponce, who worked here at the UChicago Law School Immigrant Rights Clinic.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to borrow bits and pieces from everybody else's presentation to present myself. My name is Fernanda Ponce, and I am a local Chicagoan. My parents are originally from Mexico, and I am studying race diaspora and indigeneity here at UChicago. And I have an interest in a lot of areas. To give a background on the places I've worked at before, the UChicago Immigrants Rights Clinic and the National Immigrant Justice Center. I've worked at think tanks and nonprofits and in a variety of fields, including mass incarceration and human rights in the Latin American region. And this summer, I wanted to challenge myself by looking into the immigration legal field, specifically because, as we all know, here in Chicago, Chicago has experienced an exponential increase in the migrants arriving to the city, and the city has had a whole crisis of how to handle the arrival of migrants. And so I wanted to get a closer perspective of this issue, but my work ended up being very different at the Immigrants' Rights Clinic this summer. I was actually focused on doing research and writing a report on U visas and the Voices Act compliance at law enforcement agencies across the state. And so you might be wondering, what is a U visa? A U visa is actually a special visa for which migrants who are victims of crime can apply for. And in order to apply for this special visa, they have to obtain a certification from a law enforcement agency. And so after much advocacy from immigrants' rights groups here in Illinois, the state actually passed a law that tried to streamline access that migrants have to certification agencies. And basically what this law says is that in order to get a certification, migrants have to arrive at a law enforcement agency to seek out a certification form. But as my work showed me throughout the summer, a lot of law enforcement agencies across the state are not even aware that this law exists, or they're not necessarily compliant with it. And so, as you can see on the right-hand corner, that was a spreadsheet of the qualitative research that I was doing with my co-intern, Valentina. And we were essentially writing up emails and sending FOIA requests this summer to over 300 state agencies. And that was quite a time, because sometimes you don't find a lot of the information on these agencies online. So that was quite a challenge, and it showed me the barriers that exist for migrants in terms of U visa certification here in Illinois, despite order to streamline this process. And the research, as I just mentioned, was really tedious. It was I actually talked about it sometimes in our check-ins, and it was tedious because we were trying to ensure that each agency complied with 6 categories that we defined from the law itself. One of those being, for example, making sure that this information was publicly available and public facing, which it wasn't most of the time. And the results of my research have not been concluded, because this project is ongoing still at the Rights Clinic. It's being carried out by the law students there. But by the end of the summer, after contacting all these agencies, essentially what Valentina and I found is that there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of the awareness around this law and the compliance that state agencies have to abide by. Another component of my internship was translating intakes that the clinic had with our partnership with Centro de Trabajadores Unidos. And what I learned from that is essentially that translating is a really hard job, because it takes a lot of energy and a lot of attention to detail. Sometimes even missing one sentence can change the entire context of the conversation that you're having with an individual during your intake. And that is really crucial, especially for asylum intakes or figuring out the law that applies to the cases for people. And this work is also hard because people sometimes have really hard situations that they're dealing with and that they come to the clinic with. And sometimes there's nothing you can really do for people because there are limits to the law. The law does not always account for the fact that people live really nuanced lives, and not everyone is aware of how the law functions and how the law will apply to their cases. And that is an unfortunate reality that I had to face in doing some of these intake translations, and learning that it's really important to take care of yourself emotionally and physically and mentally when doing this work, because it really takes a toll on you and you may not even realize it in the moment. The second part of my summer was focused on working with the National Immigrant Justice Center, which is a much larger organization, and I also wanted to work with them because they were one of the first proactive organizations in the city to try and create workshops for asylum seekers. And what these workshops were essentially were partnerships with pro bono clinics that helped migrants prepare pro se applications that they could submit for asylum. And essentially a pro se application is when migrants present themselves individually without any representation to the court. And so essentially NIJC and their pro bono partners helped people file applications, and it was very fascinating working with NIJC because they have a whole screening process to make sure that people have viable asylum claims to submit. And in my work, I learned that it really does take a team to do this work because there's thousands of migrants who have arrived to the city, but just the amount of work that went into screening and ensuring that 10 migrant asylum seekers arrived to our workshops was a lot. And I have a much greater appreciation in why sometimes this work can take a little longer than sometimes we wish it would. And it was also very fascinating working with pro bono volunteers because of their very vastly different experiences. Most of them did not work in immigration work. They actually worked doing finance law or things like that, and learning about their motivations for why they were working with NIJC was really fascinating. The other component that I got to do with NIJC, preparing country condition packets for asylum seekers. Basically, when you present yourself to court, you have to provide evidence of why you're being persecuted in your country. And so I did actually shout out to Ida because Human Rights Watch is actually one of the organizations that I was constantly looking at in terms of getting those reports on country conditions on the ground. And that really expanded my worldview. And I also got to do a brief court appearance for one of the asylum appointments, and just the architecture and the design of the court is one that is very fascinated to read an ethnography on immigration courts because that's something that really struck me from my experience. And also the American patriotism that was on full display by a lot of the people within that court, a lot of people wearing American flags, American shirts. So that was also a really interesting part of my experience. And to sum it all up, I just want to quickly touch upon some of the insights and takeaways that I had from this. Really, when you're applying to an internship, I would encourage everyone to really seek out a supportive community of colleagues and ensuring that you're somewhere that will be welcoming and where you can find yourself in a supportive group of people. Flexibility and adaptability is also very key when doing any of this work because things change on a day-to-day basis and you'll never know what you'll be working on a day-to-day. From a personal perspective, I learned that I may not want to do immigration law, and that's okay. It was a really great experience, and I actually got to shadow a program coordinator at NIJC, and I learned that maybe that's something that I would be more interested in doing because it is more front-facing work and because I get to interact with more people on a day-to-day basis. I also had an experience during one of my internships where I confronted conflict with one of my supervisors because of a misunderstanding that was had, and learning the soft skills in terms of addressing that conflict and ensuring that we were all good for the rest of the internship and that was addressed is also very important, and that I also want to touch upon briefly. Finally, in terms of the broader scope of this field, I think that this is a conclusion that we all know by now, that the fault is not on people, it's on systems. And I think it's really important to ensure that immigration work is better streamlined because quite frankly, there's not enough people to do the work that are needed for thousands. And this is why transparency and in terms of organization and administration of resources is key, and accountability helps ensure that systems work as they should. And of course, there's an urgent need for an immigration policy overhaul, a reimagining, if you will, because the system is not working most of the time in most people's favors. Actually, one of the hard truths of doing this work is that usually your asylum case is much stronger if you have more trauma to present to the court. And that's also one of the reasons why it can feel uncomfortable to do this work. And at the end of the day, most people want to work to support themselves and their families. And this is why we need to think of a system that can help support people to do that, and move away from the demonization that most people find in the media. So that was my experience. And if you'd like to talk with me more about that, I'd be more than happy to. My email is fponce@uchicago.edu. So reach out, and thank you all.
Hi, everybody. I know it's been a long day. I'm the last presenter, so you're almost out. My name is Hala Hersi. I am a fourth year studying anthropology and critical race and ethnic studies. My research now is focused on legacies of anti-Black surveillance and its intersections with anti-Muslim surveillance and post 9/11 Muslim racialization. So a little bit about Believers Bailout. This is the mission statement from the Believers Bailout website. It is a grassroots organization. It's a very horizontal organization. So I'm gonna just read this out to you guys. Believers Bailout is a community-led effort to bail out Muslims in pretrial incarceration in ICE custody. Based in Chicago, which is home to the largest single-site jail in the United States, Believers Bailout supports efforts to abolish money bail and to raise awareness within Muslim communities on the injustices of the bail bond system, immigration bonds, and the broader prison industrial complex of which they form part. Our aim is to move towards a world rooted in accountability and healing, rather than punitive responses of the police and prisons. We seek to create a sustainable change in our society by focusing on three major areas of concern: the prison industrial complex, anti-Muslim racism, and anti-Blackness. So as you can see, this is an organization that is very intertwined with what I want to do, what I'm doing right now. And it was very formative in thinking about my research this year also. So why Believers Bailout? Outside of my academic life, I'm also an organizer. I've worked as an organizer for the past 6 years, both in Chicago and in my home state of Indiana. So I was really interested in Believers Bailout because abolition is a key focus. I wanted to think about systems, and I wanted to think about a future in which policing and prisons don't exist, in which people don't have to worry about surveillance, people don't have to worry about over-policing in their communities, and people don't have to worry about how are they going to interact with police? What are the dangers of interacting with police? And I was also really interested in working with Believers Bailout because it's already working with established community organizations. So the logo that you see on the left, I think this is your left, is for Iman, just the inner city Muslim Action Network. It is a organization that's based here on the southwest side of Chicago. And it is an organization that for many decades has been working to support Black Muslims on the South Side and to provide community engagement and community resources. So they have a food bank, they do pottery classes, they have legal trainings for people, and they also provide help with getting people who are recently incarcerated back on their feet. So you have job trainings, you have helping people get access to cell phones, which is something that I really valued as well. And I also really wanted to work for a Muslim organization, and I also was really interested in working directly with incarcerated people. I think a lot of times with more established organizations, more bureaucratic organizations, incarcerated people are not allowed to voice exactly what they need. And this was an organization that really puts the forefront on incarcerated people and actually incorporating recently released incarcerated people into the organization and actually having them do volunteer work and actually be hired. And it was a dual focus organization. So as we were bailing out Muslims from Cook County Jail, we were also working with other state and national organizations to move towards an abolitionist future. So I just want to talk a little bit about the bailout process, which is something that I learned a lot about as I was going through my internship. So at Believers Bailout, this is a 5-tier process. So first we fundraise.
So first we fundraise. So all of the Believers Bailouts operating expenses are paid through grants, nonprofit grants, and non-zakat donations, i.e. sadaqah and charity. So these are Islamic phase of fundraising and giving charity. So yeah. And then the second part is that people apply. So families and advocates of incarcerated Muslims and incarcerated Muslims themselves sometimes will apply for support. The third phrase is post-bond. So the case is reviewed, and if the applicant meets criteria, Believers Bailout will partner with the Chicago Community Bond Fund, which is another bond fund that helps raise money to bail people out to post the bond. So posting bond is a very complicated process, and it's a very expensive process, which is something I didn't realize. So oftentimes for even lower level offenses, you'll see bonds as high as $100,000, $200,000. And so what we do, so in order to post bond to let these people be released from not even like actually being charged, just this is a pre-charge incarceration, we would raise 10% of that money. So for $200,000 bond, we would pay $20,000. For a $100,000 bond, we would pay $10,000, which is not very cheap. It's very expensive and it's very inaccessible for people who have been incarcerated. And then the fourth part is support, which is what I was mostly focused on this summer. So I was working with the post-release support team. So Believers Bailouts and other partners will provide support and connect released individuals to community resources until the case is resolved. So this includes helping people find access to jobs, food banks, phones, housing support. And then obviously the fifth part, which is the goal for Believers Bailout and many other abolitionist orgs, is to free them all. We envision a future where there are no prisons, no police, and people are allowed to live the lives that they want without fear of incarceration. So a little bit about my experience. These two pictures, the first is a picture of Cook County Jail. And then the second one is the picture of the Circuit Court of Cook County. So in my experience, what I was doing a lot of court watching. So when people have to go face their hearings, a lot of the times they're by themselves because it's very expensive to travel in Chicago. It's very inaccessible to even get to the Cook County Jail and Cook County Circuit Court by public transportation is very difficult. There is no direct public transportation to that area. You would have to get off a stop about 20 minutes away and walk the rest of the way. So just being there for jail support. I would also looking up people's cases at the Cook County Circuit Court, finding out what exactly the terms of their release were, and finding out what exactly they were charged with. And what I found a lot of the times is that these were very low level charges. We find misdemeanors, very minor things, parking tickets, people in which these are not violent offenses. And these are a lot of offenses. What you find is that these are a lot of offenses coming from the south side of Chicago. That is very overly policed. It's very heavily policed. Chicago is the most segregated city in the United States. And what you find is that all of the police presence, most of the police presence, a lot of CPD, shot spotter, is concentrated on the south side, making it very easy for people to be incarcerated for the most minor offenses. So that's what I was doing a lot over the summer, and connecting people with post-release support. So helping them find jobs, access to food banks, access to cell phones, access to housing support, crowdfunding for housing support, helping people get back in touch with their families, helping people find adequate support networks. So yeah. And so what's next? So by a show of hands, how many of you guys have heard of the Pretrial Fairness Act? Right. So Pretrial Fairness Act is a very exciting piece of legislation that was passed by the city of Chicago and by the state of Illinois. So as of September 18, 2023, judges are no longer allowed to order someone charged with the crime to pay money as a condition of their pretrial release, meaning that you can no longer, for minor offenses such as misdemeanors, you can no longer be held pre-trial. You have to be allowed out. So what does that mean? It means less people in pretrial detention due to their inability to pay bail. Again, as I stated before, bail is very expensive. Even 10%, 15% of bail, of the bond amounts often amounts to $15,000, $10,000. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars for very minor misdemeanors.
So with the Pretrial Fairness Act, the need to pay bail is decreasing. So believers bailout is moving towards supporting those who are released as a result of the PFA. So we're shifting our shifting our mission. So now post-release support is now the focus. Connecting people to jobs, connecting people to housing, so community networks, support networks, bigger, wider Muslim networks that they feel can support them and learning what their needs are and responding to their needs. But what we're also seeing is that with the Pretrial Fairness Act, because people can no longer be held in pretrial detention, electronic monitoring is now being utilized more. It was making it very difficult for people to have access to these jobs, have access to housing, have access to these support networks. And now we're also focusing as an organization, figuring out ways to like decrease the use of electronic monitoring, working with other organizations to force the state to say, why do we need electronic monitoring? Why is it so? It's such an expensive system for people, for taxpayers in general as well. So looking at why electronic monitoring is being utilized more and how can we better support people who are forced to be put on electronic monitoring. And the funny thing about electronic monitoring is that people who are released on electronic monitoring have to pay for the monitoring system themselves, which amounts to about $400 a month. So for people who are incarcerated, who have been recently released, who are coming from communities that are over-policed and underfunded, $400 a month is not a cheap bill to pay. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm still working with Believers Bailout in more of a volunteer capacity than anything. And it was an organization that I learned a lot from, and I was really honored and glad to be a part of. I feel like this is something that working with grassroots organizations, working with organizations that directly work with people and don't focus on like policy and legislation is something that I really value. And I hope that you guys learned some from my presentation.
All right, so now if folks can come up. We only have a few minutes. So I'll get us going. One thing I noticed from all the presentations was that all of you were involved in work that I think you were driven to very much by your values kind of coming in, values or ideologies, etc. So, so this is a two-part question. The second part is kind of following from this AIDA's framework, but the first part is, in what way did the internship change, if at all, kind of your ideological commitments or your values? Did it make you question them? Did it make you more convinced about them? Did it radicalize you in any way? Or are you just, basically the same? That's the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question, thinking about this kind of balance between your day-to-day and sort of the overall picture, right? So thinking about choosing a job, choosing an internship that is sort of ideologically based, or you choose that job, how do you balance that with the considerations, now that you've had one of those, with the considerations of what your day-to-day is going to look like? First, maybe one as an intern, and then also just how do you now think about it as your job, kind of as you think about jobs maybe post-college? So those are two questions, and go ahead.
Okay. I guess I could start it off. So funny enough, I came into the experience not having much confidence in government as a structure for change. I think the form of government is self-sustaining in the sense that it's more so concerned with protection of itself, which is not a horrible thing, but it's horrible when it has real life consequences. I think I was like forcing myself to consider, okay, like, I consider myself an abolitionist. I consider myself like very radical. But systems are also made of people. So it's like a situation of, did the chicken come first or the egg? What makes systems? It's people and their values and what like becomes a structure because of the decisions we make. So I think with that in mind, it's not that I like became more radical. I think I was more I was always very like strong and committed to the idea that real change is not going to come from vertical praxis. It's very much horizontal and like the people around you. But with government, I think I did feel like I had like some meaningful work, and it's like a reality you have to sit with of like, okay, not everyone is going to be like me and wants to, you know, like let's destroy everything and rebuild it. You have to like work with, some things are working within this like little tiny bit of like a giant system that I'm working with. So like in future jobs, I still want to be very like grassroots. But I was more open to like engaging with these different like you'll have legal structures. I'm not interested in law, but I think government, the negotiation between government, nonprofit, very grassroots, like all these different levels is like very important for me to like theoretically envision what kind of like social change can happen. So yeah.
Anybody else?
I guess on the kind of values thing, I think it is kind of really important to be values driven, because it is kind of an uphill battle at times, and it definitely feels like an uphill battle at times, especially when, you know, you're working in a system that has an incredibly low chance of success. But, you know, like, I think that's why the day-to-day work is so important, so that you don't kind of become too disillusioned with the systems in place. And yeah, I think like the day-to-day work of just, you know, seeing that you're actually making a meaningful impact on someone's life and someone's future, you know, it definitely helped a lot. And, you know, like, that's not to say that the system is, you know, like too broken. You know, well, like, you know, like, at least from like an outside of the US perspective, you know, like, I think that, you know, like, through my work, I was able to see that, you know, like, there are definite steps forward, even though, you know, there are tons of steps back in a bunch of other places, which I will not get into now. But yeah, no, I think that, you know, like, seeing that the work actually has an impact, not just on the micro, but also macro level as well, is also really important. Yeah.
I think, hello, can you guys hear me? I can speak a little bit more to like the grassroots sides of things. Believers Bailout is a very grassroots organization. It's a very horizontal organization. There's not a lot of hierarchy. And I think one thing going through this internship taught me is that the important, it's going to sound a little bit cheesy, but the importance of hope, and the fact that hope itself is revolutionary. And in that vein, the idea that a lot of the work, even with the Pretrial Fairness Act, which is an actual piece of legislation that was passed recently over the summer, a lot of that work came from people who were doing grassroots work, who were actually organizing on the ground, who are connecting with communities, asking communities what do they want to see. The communities that are most impacted are the communities that have to face the burden of over surveillance, over policing, and that's kind of why I think organizations like Believers Bailout are so important, is because one thing that it showed me is that actual meaningful change, there is change to come from organizing on the ground. There is change to come from grassroots organizations. You don't have to rely on already existing systems. And that the power of the people and working directly with people is actually what impacts most of the change. So what you saw is that, in my experience, is that you saw people who were released from pretrial detention, who had their court cases dropped, turn around and come back and work with Believers Bailout to help other people. And I think that's something that I really valued seeing, and something that I personally don't think I could have seen had I gone and worked for a more established, more horizontal, vertical agency.
We have time or? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Those are really great responses. Just reflecting on that, just take from another famous abolitionist, right? Hope is a discipline. So I think that, that's something that you have to constantly be reminded of, especially if you do policy work that, might be hard to see the change on a day-to-day, but, you have to kind of force yourself. And thinking about that in terms of how do you get through the workday, I wanted to talk about maybe the support systems that you relied on, whether it was folks at work, whether it was your friends, family, whether it was, the Pozen Center or other resources at school. Just trying to think about, how when you're dealing with these difficult topics, and the days are very intense and can be long. What are some things or people that you relied on to help you kind of get through that?
At MIJC, I was actually part of a couple, messaging systems internally, and something that all the lawyers did on a weekly basis was shout out their colleagues and the cases that they won and the work that they were doing, and just being able to focus on the positive sides of that work and keeping that hope alive within the organization, even when there were some really tough cases. And that I think that was really really beneficial for me to see in terms of, because I can be somewhat of a pessimist sometimes. So to be able to see the work that goes into creating hope, as Miriam Kaba says, that hope is a discipline, and a discipline requires that constancy of being able to encourage others, which was really helpful for me.
I think like at work, I really love my supervisor. Shout out to Julia. And like the entire team was like really sweet of like the other interns, because another UChicago person also worked Nitya at Cook County. But like on the personal side, I just want to like shout out my boyfriend. He was like there for me the whole summer when I needed it. And I was thankful a lot of my friends were like in the Chicago area. So I got to like go out on weekends, and when I'm done with work and I decompress, I get to see them. And that's like, don't neglect like your personal friends when you're working.
I'm just going to talk from a bit of a different perspective. My job was actually, I think, out of all the panelists and probably everyone here in like the Pozen Symposium overall, the least stressful job, because I was not dealing with any research. I didn't have to read any of the reports that we were putting out. All I had to do was do summaries of how the press releases were doing. So I just had to go through, look up keywords, and just see whether it was doing well in, in Chile, and why was it doing well in Chile for some odd reason. Was it doing well in Spanish? Was it doing well in English? Was it doing well in Arabic? So a very not stressful job. There was not a lot to deal with in terms of very intense things to see. So if you are looking for a job that works with human rights, but is not very intense in terms of very difficult human rights abuses that you have to constantly deal with, there are options out there as well. And it's not some kind of failing that you're like, I just cannot handle seeing these things every day.
All right, well, I think that's a good place to end the panel. So thank you everyone for sharing your experiences. I'm sure that everyone learned a lot for sure. And congratulations on concluding this cycle. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It's nearly time for our networking lunch, but I do want to introduce Julia, who we've heard about, thanks to Danielle from the Cook County Department of Human Rights and Ethics. Just wanted to introduce herself a little bit. She's an intern herself, so we really want to learn a little bit more about what your internship experience was like as an undergrad and how it influenced you to where you are in school.
Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Eplinzaf, and I am policy analyst in the Department of Human Rights and Ethics, which includes Cook County's Commission on Human Rights. I had the pleasure of being an internship host this summer. I had such a fun time with it, and I was kind of thinking about how it's a little bit full circle for me, because I was an intern myself almost a decade ago, and I was thinking last night / this morning / in the car on the way here, kind of what I did as an intern. And it is essentially what I do now, which is the coolest, probably the coolest part for me. In 2014, I think was the right year, I worked at Latin United Community Housing Association, LUCHA, which is a affordable housing developer and also anti-gentrification advocacy organization in Humboldt Park. And while there, I gave Know Your Rights presentations on fair housing. I do that exact same thing now. And I also, while at Lucha, kind of helped in tenant organizing and did a continuation of research from the previous summer when I was a Summer Links intern with former Governor Quinn's office on research regarding where affordable, accessible units are. So Section 811 units are in the city compared to where resources and advocacy organizations for people with disabilities are located in the city. So lines very similarly with what I do now in my work. One thing I always like to mention, because there is a sincere lack of knowledge about this law that I try to share as much as possible, is that in Cook County, including Chicago, we have the Just Housing Amendment, which means that people who are returning residents who have conviction records that are older than 3 years old can't be discriminated against in housing applications and rental applications, things like that. And then there are a lot of other aspects of the law that support returning residents, but sharing about that is a large part of my job. And that's all I plan to talk about. I'm really, really grateful to Pozen. I think this is a really important part of UChicago and was an incredible portion of my time here at UChicago. So to the extent that I can be of help or service to any of you, I really would love to do that. And Cook County's hiring, so